SDK generation platforms are an increasingly popular way of building, managing, and maintaining SDKs for APIs. In this video, we're going to get an overview of Speakeasy, an OpenAPI native platform for generating robust SDKs. We're going to dive deep into the platform with founding developer advocate Nolan Sullivan and get his advice on how to take your newly created SDKs to market. If SDK generation, API development, and best practices are your thing, subscribe to the channel for weekly videos on all things API. Let's get started. Hey Nolan, welcome to the channel. Thank you very much for joining us. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Martin.
Tell us a little bit about you, what it is that you're doing at Speakeasy, and I guess also a little bit about your journey to working there in the first place.
My name is Nolan Sullivan. I joined Speakeasy 2.5 years ago as the first employee. I've been working on Speakeasy's developer relations program since the beginning. Along the way, I also had the opportunity to do lots of other stuff as the company's grown. And yeah, still chugging along today.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Speakeasy then. Can you give us the overview of, what Speakeasy is, what's the overall offering, and where you are right now as a company?
Yeah, sure. So Speakeasy, we're trying to build the complete tool chain for REST API development. What we're most known for today is our SDK generation and some of our OpenAPI management capabilities. But the vision for the future is to kind of expand to the entire development lifecycle for APIs. So testing, actually, managing the deployments of your API, and actually building and designing the API itself.
All right, well, look, let's get into the meat of what it is that we're here to talk about. It's SDK generation. So can you show us what Speakeasy does and how it actually works to generate an SDK?
So I'm looking at this company MoneyHub. This is just one that I happened upon the other day. And they had a really nice spec. So I just thought that I would use them for this demo. They're like a open banking provider.
And for clarity, this is a real company, right?
Oh, yeah. This is a real company. Yeah. I live in Bristol. This is a Bristol-based company. I just happened to be on their website just because I was seeing like what's in the local tech community. And then I saw that they had an API. So I was like, all right, cool. I'm going to go check it out. All right, so let's go into here. So this is their API documentation. Looks like they're using README. And here's a fun little trick. If someone's using README, you can go into the URL, and if you just go OpenAPI, you'll get this page, which has all their specs. And so I can go to this one, which will just show it in pretty print. So this is looks like it's like their some sort of a payments open banking API. So anyway, so I'm going to copy the URL for this spec, and we're going to use this to power generation of SDKs. So I'm going to go over to my terminal now, and I'm going to use the Speakeasy CLI, and I'm just going to run the quick start command. And the quick start command, first thing it's going to ask you for is an OpenAPI documentation location. So I'm going to use the URL. You alternatively could choose to use a spec that you had on your computer locally if you wanted. You could just enter the file path. I'm going to give this a name. So I'll call it MoneyHub. And this is just how people will invoke API calls when they're using the SDK. And then you can pick the language that you want to generate. We support about 10. I'm going to go ahead and use TypeScript, which is generally the most commonly used. And then I'm going to give it a package name. Not super relevant because I'm just going to be doing this generation locally, but this becomes important when you're actually getting ready to publish to a package manager. So I'll go ahead and do MoneyHub, and I'll write it to an output directory. Okay, so now Speakeasy is actually doing the generation. The first step is that it's going to validate the OpenAPI spec to make sure it's valid. Like I said, they've got a pretty good spec, so this one is valid. And now it's doing the actual generation. Looks like that was successful. So now it's actually going to compile the code that was just generated to make sure that everything works when the library is actually compiled.
It's pretty fast. Is it also going to run tests against the SDK before it finalizes it?
This is not. However, we've just built the alpha of a testing module. And the testing module is full contract testing for the SDK and the API. And that runs if you have it set up like in production and the generation is happening in a GitHub repo, it will run the contract test suite against for every method in the SDK. So yeah, not locally, but yes, definitely if you're using it in production. Okay, so this successfully generated, and it's saying that there are some improvements that could be made to the spec. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the studio. And so this is just basically a rendering of the README for the generated library. This is the spec. This is the generated README. But the README gives you like a good indication of kind of what's been created. So you can actually see like what it would look like to invoke a call with the SDK. And one of the most common things that people usually want to do is clean up method names. So the convention for SDK generation is to use the operation IDs in the OpenAPI spec when you're doing method name creation. But sometimes those method names are not super idiomatic in the sense that you're going to have accounts.getAccounts, where probably users would prefer to have something like accounts.get, accounts.create, rather than like accounts.postAccounts. Just that saving that little bit of extra code. So we have something using AI that will go and evaluate the spec and try and create more idiomatic method names for the package. So that's what's happening here.
The question about the operation ID, we see a lot of OpenAPI documents that actually don't have that in place. If you were to put a spec into Speakeasy that didn't have it, what would it do? Would it fail out when you first put it through the CLI, or would it try to adapt and generate the names in some other way?
Actually, looking at I'm actually pretty sure that this spec doesn't have operation IDs, to your point. And so actually what's happening here is that we're doing like a very naive default. Well, now this is the fixed, but before we were doing a very naive default where it was generating like a unique name based on the path and the operation that was being performed. But yeah, now this is actually overwriting those defaults and is giving it like a nice clean interface. So rather than accounts.getAccounts, it's accounts.list. Rather than accounts.postAccounts, it's accounts.create. And so here you can see the difference in the invocation. And so yeah, that was all generated using AI, and I can just go ahead and I can approve it. And one of the cool things about the studio is that it's synced with your local directory. So now it's actually triggering a regeneration of the SDK in my on my computer. So I'll go back after that's done generating, and then we can take a look at the code to make sure that it looks correct.
It brings a level of CRUD cleanliness to an SDK that I've seen a lot of times from generated SDKs done, I guess, in the more old school way, would not necessarily have had any attention paid to it.
Yeah, and all this is totally customizable. Like the AI exists to kind of give people a head start, but you can always go back and you can make any changes that you would want. So like I'm sure there's some things in here. For example, there's transactions. Yeah, so maybe like within here, there's this thing called a transaction split, for example. Don't really know what that is because I'm not super familiar with the domain space, but maybe rather than saying transactions.update split, maybe you want to have it say transactions.splits.update, right? So those are the kind of things that people might want to go back and customize themselves. But let's go back and let's take a look. So I've got the SDK in this MoneyHub TypeScript directory. And I'll just pop this open. And yeah, you can see that we've actually gone and it's created a full library. So this is the README that we were looking at before, but you can actually go and see that, we've got a source directory. It's got all the different types. It's got functions for all the different methods that exist in the API. So it's a full and ready to use SDK.
Now that this is done, I guess the next step would be, work with it, test it, build stuff with it, figure out if there's anything else that you need to change, and then head towards actually publishing it so that other people can use it, right?
Yeah, exactly. If we were going to actually take this to full completion, probably the next step would be iterating with it locally, testing it manually to make sure that it looks the way you want, it behaves it the right way. At that point, a lot of people tend to discover that there are gaps in their OpenAPI spec itself. Like a lot of times the SDK becomes a vehicle for actually improving the OpenAPI spec because people are actually really starting to use their public definition for the first time. And then after that, you would want to push this code to GitHub and then set up like an action so that it's regenerating whenever there's a change to the OpenAPI spec. That's to make sure that the SDK never gets stale. And then last step would be publishing it to NPM in this case, or whatever the relevant package manager is. And Speakeasy handles all of that. We have a GitHub action that gets set up automatically. We'll handle the publishing whenever there's a change to the GitHub repo. So it's just a few more steps of config.
Yeah. Okay. So the full end-to-end from generation to packaging to publication, Speakeasy can take care of all of that. I don't necessarily have to go and set up that final end of the pipeline if I don't want to. But if I do want to handle that myself, is that possible? I can just do it directly from GitHub from there?
Absolutely. The way that we've built, you don't even have to use our GitHub action if you want. You can write your own. You can just use the CLI directly. So we provide a lot of tooling to make it as easy as possible, but we have plenty of clients that kind of want to chop and change and only use specific parts of the tool set that we've created, and that's totally fine.
And if, for instance, we now want to go and create a Ruby SDK, it would be exactly the same process, just select Ruby this time from the CLI, and it's going to go through exactly the same steps, yeah?
Yep, exactly. Speakeasy quick start, set up Ruby. You point it at the same spec, and you're kind of off to the races.
So it is possible to have your full suite of SDKs set up and ready to go in one day if you wanted it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we basically move as fast as the other teams can. And like I said, I think generally most of the onboarding time that we have with our customers is actually helping them make improvements to their API and their OpenAPI spec. Again, it's just once you have the SDK, I think it really encourages people to play with their API and their OpenAPI specs in a way that they didn't before. And so in that process, they discover improvements that they want to make to the public interface.
Just curious about that aspect of, people, really playing with their API for the first time once they get an SDK generated for it, or at least they attempt to generate an SDK for it. What are some of the common things that you've seen with customers so far when it comes to the changes you're helping them make? What are things that people are missing or forgetting about or wanting to go back and adapt so that they can get the most out of SDKs that are generated by Speakeasy?
So definitely, I think that one that's pretty common is authentication. A lot of people don't have auth defined correctly in their OpenAPI spec, especially when it's an OAuth-based implementation. We see a lot of people that have, in a lot of cases, they just kind of leave it blank, or they just, it says OAuth, but it doesn't really have the specifics. And it's just because that section of the spec isn't really used that much by other tooling. Maybe with your docs, it might be, but it's just maybe looking at the URL and looking at the mechanism. It's not looking at kind of the further details. So that's one where we see people iterating quite a bit. Some other ones, parameters, we'll definitely have a lot of people who discover that, they have query parameters in one place. They've got, header params in another, and it's mismatched all over the API. And so that's something that they tend to want to patch. Or, sometimes they choose to kind of, one of the nice things about an SDK is that it can sometimes paper over some of the issues with an API. I'd always encourage people to go and actually fix it at the root. But if that's not possible, like an SDK can kind of help you skate over some of those, some of that ugliness. Another one that's been coming up more recently, I think just because of all the AI stuff, has been server sent events. Also because there's no standard way to describe that in OpenAPI. We've made kind of a choice based on, there was like a fairly detailed thread on the OpenAPI like GitHub. And so we kind of made an implementation that seems to have been adopted by people in the community. But a lot of people are looking for like that kind of feedback, in the absence of, because OpenAPI is really flexible which is great. But sometimes people are kind of looking for suggestions on what's the best way to describe something in the places in the spec that are a little bit more gray.
Let's say that I've got an SDK, it's done, I built it with Speakeasy, I'm happy with it, it's out there in the world. What tips have you got for how I can actually go to market with that? What's, building the SDK is one thing, but actually getting people to use it and adopt it is another. Do you offer up advice? Do you have some advice perhaps about how I can go ahead and do that?
I definitely would say the first thing to do is just to talk about it, which seems fairly obvious, but a lot of people, when they build SDKs, not everyone will go and actually talk to the language community to let them know that they've got they now support that community or that group of users. So it might be worth, depending on what you do, it might be worth taking out a couple ads in some language-based community newsletters. It's also worth, a lot of people have never asked their existing customers what languages they use. And so I think going back and doing a review of your customers and asking them what languages they work in, that can often help. Like sometimes you want to just go back and let them know that you've now got an SDK so that they can update their implementation. So those are two that are those are like good low-hanging fruit. Another one that really helps is integrating your SDKs with your documentation. So a lot of people, if you have that classic kind of 3-panel docs view where the right-hand bar is the code samples, rather than just having like a generic code snippet that features like say a fetch, using fetch to call an API, you could actually have the code sample represent using your SDK. And so that just encourages your users when they're looking at your docs to be aware that there are SDKs, go and download them, install them, and then, start using them because the code snippets that they see are all referencing that. That's something that Stripe does really well. If you don't ever want an example of kind of a company that does a good job of publicizing their SDKs, it's Stripe.
When it comes to actually building SDKs, the companies do have a choice of how they approach it, right? They could build this in-house, if they wanted to, and if they had the people around to do it. Why would they not go down that route and choose to use something like Speakeasy to generate their SDKs?
I mean, we've had more and more companies who are companies that have had SDKs for a long time and are now kind of making the change from handwritten to generated because the quality of the generated SDKs has kind of gotten to the point where there's parity. I would say, I think that handwritten SDKs, it makes a lot of sense. I think when you have a small team and you're just starting out and maybe you have people that are really passionate about building in a certain language. And so, there's some guy who just really loves Go is like, I'll go write the Go SDK, no problem. But that becomes really hard to sustain in the long term. It ends up being the case that, that guy who is super passionate about Go leaves the company and you don't actually have anyone left who's super passionate about Go. And so it becomes a big problem. Like you have this library that exists, there are customers that depend on it, and yet you don't have the expertise in-house to actually manage it effectively. And so that's kind of the risk you run when you're developing them yourselves. And I think one of the other nice things about generating SDKs is that you can kind of do it on demand. So in the case that you have a customer come in and, I don't know, they're building in PHP and nobody in your team wants to build a PHP SDK, you can just go and generate it, and you're now able to serve that customer or win that contract. And you didn't have to expend your team's valuable time to go and build this artifact that would then become stale.
So Nolan, we're heading up to 2025 right now, and I want to ask you a couple of questions about where you think things are going to go next year as far as, the API, SDK generation space, like API tooling, anything in there that you think is going to be kind of like breakthrough processes, terms, tools, anything that's really going to be, breakout in 2025 that you can think of. We'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, well, not to be boring, but AI is obviously where my mind goes. I think it's pretty interesting if you are an API builder and you have a public API. I think that in some ways you're now competing with AI models in terms of how your users are going to integrate with your API. You want to have an experience that is as good, if not better, than what they get from just plugging, how do I integrate with X API into an LLM? And so I'm really interested to see how that develops. In my head, it's something along the lines of having SDKs for your API and then offering some sort of a AI chat on top of that, like in your docs, where users can say, I want to do X. I want to create a transaction for this product or something like that. And then the AI has knowledge of your SDKs and is able to build kind of a custom code snippet for your user in the language of their choice and using the methods of their choice. So I feel like some experience like that is kind of where this is going to be going, rather than here's a list of everything that's available, pick through and find the ones you want, and look at the code samples and figure out how to combine them together. I feel like that is going to fade, and we're going to get more of the type in what you want, and then we'll render a custom example for you.
Well, Nolan, thanks very much for joining us. We appreciate you coming and sharing what it is that Speakeasy can do as far as SDK generation goes. As you can see, it is super quick. If you want to try out Speakeasy for yourselves, there's a link in the description below. And of course, I'm sure you can reach out to Nolan if you have any questions as well. If you like this video, don't forget to like it down below, and also click on subscribe so you can be notified about weekly videos on all things API. And we'll see you in the next video.